Welcome to History San Diego. I'm George Farrar. As we do from time to time here on the channel, I now take a look beyond San Diego at a decade in American history. In October of 1850, there was a great celebration in San Francisco at Portsmouth Square because California was admitted to the United States. Statehood was granted. Now, it's important as we look at our study of the 1850s, looking specifically at the United States, that there was a balance of power between slave states and free states, states that allowed slavery within their borders and states that did not. And along comes the great American West, including California, as a result of a number of factors, including being victorious in the Mexican-American War. The United States was increasingly had many people leaving the cities back east and going to get their fortune in California. A lot of them would either travel over land or by steamer, and they were on the hunt for gold that had been discovered, and they were really trying to build a new life in the West. So increasingly, not just in California, but in Oregon and in the New Mexico and Utah territories, settlers were showing up. And in California, with gold discovered and all these people pouring in, it was time to create a state constitution for consideration for statehood. And so the state of California had a group of people. These were people that were from back east, okay? All these people were relatively new to the state. Okay, they sat down and drafted a constitution. A Declaration of Rights was the first portion of this proposed constitution. This first constitution for the state of California that was written when it was a territory, it got right to it. In Article 1, Section 1, it says, "All men are by nature free and independent, and have certain inalienable rights, among which are those of enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining safety and happiness." The operative word in this opening sentence, essentially, to this Constitution that would be approved in an election in November 1849, the operative word is free. California wanted to be admitted as a free state. No slavery. Now, before you get wild notions about what was going on in California in 1850, I would remind you that if you look at the 1849 Constitution, the only votes that it guarantees are the votes of white people, specifically white men. This was something that was that was going to be a factor in how the state was going to be admitted, because there was, as I mentioned, a balance of power. And so California would be coming into the Union in a different way than others have. And in some ways, a very fortunate way, as we'll see. Interestingly, the Constitution actually had a provision that would have enabled the legislature, through a supermajority, to grant the right to vote to Native Americans, the native people, what were the people that were then called Indians, that they would be given the right to vote. But the legislature would have to pass that in supermajority. So it is interesting to see all of this happening, and to keep in mind that even before it was officially admitted to the Union, the California legislature convened as a legislature of the territory in December of 1849. And of course, as you know, through our History San Diego series, in the 1850, the local municipalities, the county and the city were chartered out by the legislature to even before statehood was granted. So we look now to the east. We look to the nation's capital. We look to Washington, D.C., and I'm sure a lot of people back then looked to Washington, D.C. They didn't find that much leadership there. There were a lot of problems. There were a lot of issues involving slavery. This was an entire economic thing, pools of people that were governed under a whip governed under an overseer and a master. Okay, so all of these political dimensions of what would you do with these people and what will happen with the labor. Henry Clay, a senator, a United States senator, one of the senators from Kentucky, decided to propose to Congress what we would know today as a Compromise of 1850. Now, as all this is going on, there's a dynamic. We have Zachary Taylor, who had been elected president, along with his vice president, Millard Fillmore. And one would wonder, what did Zachary Taylor think of this compromise? Well, it didn't much matter because he died. He died of a gastrointestinal disorder, possibly linked to cholera. And so Millard Fillmore takes office as President of the United States. And so this provides a dynamic of a new man in the White House at this critical moment in history. And so what happens with the Compromise of 1850 is it's a number of acts of legislation where California would be admitted as a free state. The Utah and New Mexico territories would be given the opportunity to vote on whether they wanted slavery or not. There would be something called the Fugitive Slave Act. And what's interesting about it is that, and this will set us up for later in the decade when there's a critical moment. What happens is that under the Fugitive Slave Act, if someone, a slave, runs from a slave state and goes into a free state, that slave can be hunted down and extracted from the free areas, the free states or territories, and returned back to their master. Okay? A very complicated process because you're talking about different states and you're talking about a very turbulent time in American history. And so it was one of the things I think that rubbed people really the wrong way, in a sense. It was a very much of an injustice because though someone got out of a slave situation and were living free in a free area, that didn't matter. They could be hunted down. And this was sustained by Franklin Pierce. We'll learn about him momentarily. And so this, along with the outlawing of slavery in the District of Columbia, this is what is presented and ultimately approved. And so it's through this backdrop that California is admitted to the United States. There's even more work to be done, though. But when you look at the map and you can see what we can see here, you can see where there's going to be a lot of issues in the future as these territories start to be subdivided into states. And we'll talk about that in just a moment as well, because it's going to get very bloody very quickly. In the 1850s, the United States Capitol building was expanded and 2 new chambers were constructed for the House and Senate. There would even be a new dome, but that wouldn't take shape until the early 1860s. So California is admitted to the Union on September 9th, 1850. And so we have these dichotomies here. We have plantation living and people on plantations and slaves. And then we have these industrious cities with ports. And in these cities, coming into these cities, increasingly are immigrants. A lot of these being Irish immigrants, Chinese immigrants. They're coming into the United States of America. And there's this big technology, the railroad, and we'll talk more about technology in a special show later on in our History San Diego series. But the railroads are expanding, okay? So we're really looking at a situation where there are these vast areas, but there's a technology coming along that's going to bring trains instead of necessarily wagons and ships to cities as a way of transport. Recently in our series, I've promised to talk with you about the Gadsden Purchase. The Gadsden Purchase was named after the minister to Mexico, what we would now call as an ambassador, James Gadsden. He was authorized to work a deal out with Mexico. This is going to have a tremendous amount of significance for Southern California and really the entire Southwest, because this purchase of land was going to enable the construction of a Southern Transcontinental Railroad, which we'll be talking about increasingly through the series. And so we see this area. Now, at this point, Arizona hadn't been designated as a territory or a state, but a considerable amount of Arizona, what we know of today as Arizona, is going to come about as a result of this purchase of Mexican land. And that was made possible with a deal with General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, back again in Mexico to have another term as president. So this plaque here designates, talks about the Gadsden Purchase for $15 million in gold, amended to $10 million for 29.640 square miles. It maintained the Southern Railroad and wagon routes, but preserved Mexico's link to Baja California. All right, so we now have Franklin Pierce, and Franklin Pierce is one of the most tragic presidents I think that we've ever had. He comes in to his presidency at a critical time for the country, but right before, months before his inauguration, which would be on March the 4th, 1853, earlier that year, his son was killed in a very bad railroad accident. Both President-elect Pierce and his wife witnessed this gruesome death of their son. And so he enters the White House under tragic circumstances. It doesn't help matters that his vice president dies within a month. And back then, vice presidents weren't appointed if they were to die or resign. So he just didn't have a vice president for most of his term. And he served one term. He allowed the Kansas-Nebraska Act to go forward, and it was bloody. There was a lot of violence that was going on in Kansas and Nebraska as they were trying to form up as states. There was even violence in the United States Senate chamber when a congressman walked in and beat a senator with his cane. Okay, so we have all of these things happening, and then along comes Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave. His master moved around a lot because he was involved with the military, and so wherever his master went, the slave had to follow. Ultimately, they ended up in free territory, and ultimately what happened was Dred Scott petitioned for his freedom, and he petitioned the federal court system. So it winds through the federal court system, and ultimately it reaches the Supreme Court of the United States, and we know how powerful the Supreme Court is. And Chief Justice Roger Taney is going to write an opinion along with other justices that's going to be considered one of the worst opinions ever written. And I think it really ultimately, when we look to what ultimately destroyed the environment for compromise and reconciliation, this was it. Because basically he said African Americans were not citizens of the United States of America, so they couldn't even have their petitions to the federal court considered, okay? Simply for the fact that these African American people in the United States of America were not considered citizens. That would be fixed later on after the Civil War. The 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution would outlaw slavery and grant citizenship to native-born and naturalized people inside the United States of America. But it is one of the worst Supreme Court decisions. It rivals a number of decisions for being the worst. And inserting a slight bit of personal commentary here, it is amazing how this nation, through its Constitution, granted so much power to these individuals on the Supreme Court. But we also look at judicial review that happened with Marbury versus Madison. And ultimately, this is what creates such an acrimonious environment, also inflamed by the media of the time. Along comes James Buchanan. He is elected president. And again, we're looking at situations where there's a lot of trying to preserve the status quo without rocking the boat, so to speak. Okay? So James Buchanan is considered, if not the worst, one of the worst presidents of the United States. So we had a really, by my opinion, a rotten Chief Justice in Roger Taney, a very lack of leadership throughout the 1850s to deal with the core problems. And ultimately things flare up in a little place called Harpers Ferry. And what happens is a man named John Brown, who had actually killed people along with some others in Kansas during what they called Bleeding Kansas. Okay, he killed some men in Kansas and gets away with it. And years later, he shows up in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. And what he's going to do, he's going to try to start a war. He's going to try to start a war by engaging African Americans along with other sympathetic abolitionists to attack the arsenal in Harpers Ferry. Now, this revolt is put down. Ironically, the Marines are led by a general named Robert E. Lee. And ultimately, though, what happens is it's put down and John Brown is hung. There's an old song about John Brown's body. The 1850s were tumultuous times. California is granted statehood at the beginning of the decade, but by the end, one would have to ask, what on earth did California join? We know that a lot is going to happen in the 1860s. Ironically, in this period of time, San Diego's population is going to drop somewhat. The big boost that's going to bring San Diego where it needs to be will be in the 1860s after the American Civil War. But really in this timeline, we're left with an upcoming election in 1860. And there's a man named Abraham Lincoln, a country lawyer, a one-term congressman, a great orator who debated Senator Stephen Douglas for a Senate seat from Illinois, and he lost that election. But he's going to run for president in 1860. And it's amazing the directions that the country will be taken. One would think someone with James Buchanan's experience would have been able to have accomplished a lot, but he leaves as a one-term failed president. By 1861, the United States of America will have new leadership, but it will have a bloody civil war. I want to thank you for watching this episode of History San Diego, where we looked at the 1850s. In the future, we'll be looking at the 1860s, the 1870s. We'll be looking at technology. Increasingly, technology in the 19th century is going to have great impact upon San Diego. But first, we have some shows that I want us to get through that will span the 1850s, but be localized at what's going on in San Diego. So I want to thank all of you for watching. Encourage you to please check out our Facebook page, our Facebook group page, History San Diego. Also, I have a website, theleftturnetwork.com. And also, we have our shows here on YouTube. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe. In the comments section, please let me know what you think and you can always click the bell icon on YouTube to get notifications whenever I do a video. We do them monthly, with the exception of during the summer. And so I want to thank all of you for watching, and take it easy. See you later.